Welcome to the Business of Us, where we focus on the intersection of business, relationships, and family life. This season, we're focused on the three mountains of partnership, purpose, and passion, which are the three big challenges that all couples face throughout their relationship. Whether you're scaling your first mountain or you're looking back at the summit, these episodes will give you stories, strategies, and inspiration for the journey. Please keep in mind that our podcast is for information only and is not therapy. If you need professional support, we recommend visiting psychologytoday.com. So a brief reminder that this season on The Business of Us, we're exploring the three mountains. This is a great framework for the journey that entrepreneurial couples are going to face throughout their lives. So mountain one is all about the how, that moment where we say, how do we make it work when things get really hard and the demands of business and personal and family become more than we think we can handle? Mountain two is all about what? Recalibrating after we've had success and asking what comes next. What do I really want now? And then mountain three is all about who. We are discovering our identity, our vision for the future after we've reached the point where family and career are starting to exit the core of what we're focusing our lives around. Today's big question: why are so many entrepreneurs unhappy when they finally achieve their dreams? And how does that impact their relationships? And what can we do about it? Today, I'm very excited to welcome my co-host, Jamie Bourne. Jamie is a licensed therapist who works globally with EO and YPO members, entrepreneurs, and their families. She helps them to navigate the unique pressures that come with having a high-performance business and high-stakes relationships. Jamie is a sought-after speaker, retreat leader, and workshop facilitator, and she's deeply passionate about helping entrepreneurs and their families to navigate this intersection of mental, relational, and family wellness. Jamie, thank you so much for joining us.
Super excited.
I mean, you have to join because it's your podcast. But anyway, you're the guest of honor today. So I'd love to start with, tell us a little about why are you so passionate about this topic on a personal level? How does it relate to your own story?
So I'm really passionate about all of this. I think in particular, though, this concept of purpose has been really, really resonating with me. And I know that it's deep-seated for me. You know, I grew up in an entrepreneurial household, high performance household, high achievement household. And one of the things that I experienced growing up was this almost lack of identity outside of the external achievements that were there. And so what I know now is that not having this clear sort of purpose around who I am and a strong identity really led me down some dark paths. And so I think as I've moved into the space of helping other people to avoid perhaps some of the pitfalls that I experienced, this concept of identity and purpose just continues to reverberate. And so this mountain in particular, I love all of the mountains, but this mountain in particular is fascinating to me just because I know the side effects of not having a strong sense of self and having everything sort of wrapped into what is the goal that I'm achieving? What is this thing that I'm building? And not having a strong sense that extends beyond that. That's why this is super important to me.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And I actually probably should have clarified. So this episode, we're especially focused on mountain two, this question, as we said, of, what happens when we achieve success. And I feel like maybe mountains one and three are a little more intuitive. Like, we think of young parents, wrestling with, let's say, two kids and two careers, or folks who are moving into retirement and all of a sudden they've lost their identity as a professional or a parent, whatever it might be. But this kind of counterintuitive idea that, hey, we've been working so hard and we get that thing we've been looking for. So I'm curious, is it a bad thing? Does it always leave people disoriented, or are there patterns or things that we can do to prepare in advance of achieving that success that helps some people to navigate it better than others?
I think on some level, it does always leave us disoriented, although that's not always necessarily a negative. Sometimes the disorientation is a positive thing that we've prepared for. And so I think that there's some predictable patterns to the transitions that we can prepare for, and then some that sort of show up in somewhat of a surprising way. So I think people who tend to navigate the disorientation in a positive way are people who are expecting the disorientation. And so when they experience it, it doesn't feel quite so foreign. And there's a little bit of a framework that people can put around to describe what they're experiencing. They're anticipating the transition. They may already have a good idea on how they're going to utilize that space of disorientation. What are they going to do to kind of recalibrate and reorient to the next space? And then what are some of the things that they're already aware of in terms of anchors that extend outside of that successful marker or whatever the thing that they're looking for? And so I think when you've got those things in place, that second mountain becomes an opportunity for growth and not just the source of confusion. And I think some of the pitfalls around that on the flip side of that is when we're so focused on the how, right? And figuring out how we're going to get to there. And then all of a sudden you summit and you look around and you're like, ooh, I don't actually know what to do next. And so that can be really confusing, I think, for folks.
Yeah, and I like this framing of anchors because you mentioned not having a strong sense of self identity, but I would say on average I feel like entrepreneurs are accused of the opposite of having too strong a sense of self identity. Maybe sounds like what you're saying. It's a bit of an unanchored. It's entirely anchored in achievements and it's not anchored in other things. So how do we find some of those anchors that are something other than our status or our achievements?
It's so interesting to me because when you first meet somebody, what are some of the first questions that you get? Oh, what do you do? Right? They want to know externally what it is that you're doing, but we're not asking questions to gauge sort of sense of self. And so I think a good litmus test for that is to really ask yourself, who am I? And if you find yourself naturally primarily going to things that are external in nature or really tied into the business entity, and there isn't much around you as a person or the quality of your relationships, that can be a good indicator that, and not to say that it's inherently negative. It's not, it's just insufficient, that there should be more tied to your identity and purpose outside of just the external pieces.
Yeah, I remember this phrase from when I was sent into the world of cognitive behavioral therapy through a lot of just challenges I was facing. And I'd never heard this phrase before, that your work is your worth. And I think it very much summarized who I was. And there was this quip that if your work is your worth, then every time there's an economic recession, you'll suffer an emotional recession. And it kind of resonated with me as to kind of like that was such a big chink in my armor, so to speak. So I'm curious, even if you've got these anchors, like, by nature, most all entrepreneurs, I assume, like we're doers, we're builders. We like to take action. We like lives of action. So something comes afterwards. And I got this advice from a friend who was a business coach who's worked with all these entrepreneurs. And he said, as I was nearing my exit, I was like, hey, like who are the people who do really well? And he said, not like many things in life, there was kind of a golden mean. There were the people who just grab the first thing possible, because they can't stand to, I guess not have a thing they're actively working on. And then there's the people who get a little bit lost and they sort of enter this semi-retired life and they don't know how to start back up. So how can an entrepreneur find that golden mean between jumping right back in and getting lost with no direction?
This to me really has to do with awareness around your own kind of individual personality traits and recognizing that different personality traits have different pulls when we enter into these more unknown spaces, right? So people, high achievers, perfectionists, they're more prone to identity crisis and burnout post exit. For people who are more visionary kind of explorer, they thrive in the what's next stage and being really energized by new possibilities. And so those personality traits may enter into this space naturally, already being a little more equipped to navigate that terrain. Right. Alternatively, if you're more oriented as like a pragmatist or builder space, there could be some struggle with some of that unstructured downtime, right? And not having like a concrete project to be working on. So I think a lot of this is really being very, very aware of the personality traits that cause you to thrive and then how to plan to navigate some of that, knowing where your natural tendency is, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it absolutely does. I'm curious if you could say a little more about burnout, because I think I was personally very lucky because I was able to separate the sale of my company from stepping down as CEO. And I had 4 years of working 3 days a week. And so honestly, by the time I left, I was really ready and I'd had a lot of space in my life to think about what I wanted to do next. But I feel like most people that I have seen exit their companies, it's like they have worked so hard and they often are pushing really hard to, they've got clauses in their sale terms that, the revenues or profits need to be here or there. So they're kind of like it's like they're sprinting through the last 6 miles of the marathon, and they're honestly just kind of burnt out by the time they get there. Like, do you have any thoughts on, for an entrepreneur who's feeling that way, they've summited, but they are just, the tank is empty, how they can navigate that process?
Yeah, I think the best way that I've heard burnout put is that burnout is a byproduct of trying to be superhuman for too long. And I think that that's really exactly what you're describing. And sometimes it's really clear to people that you're burnt out. And in other spaces, you don't actually realize that you're burnt out until the thing that's causing the burnout is gone. Right. So sometimes in the absence of the stressor, all of a sudden your system drops in and you're like, oh, and so I think in those instances, taking the space and the time that you need to have your nervous system down regulate, where you can take the time to re-energize and rest, right? I think sometimes rest is just as important as the work that you put in, and we don't oftentimes give ourselves permission to have that space of rest. And so, post exit, post goal achievement can be a really good opportunity to do that. And then to really look at what are the things that were driving this level of burnout for me. It's not sustainable in the long term. And so that then becomes part of the recalibration process around how am I going to structure this differently moving forward to avoid some of these things.
I mean, I seem to remember a podcast you and I were supposed to record when you were sick and you've been working 1,000 hours, and you finally were willing just to go home because rest is the work sometimes. So I think you counseled yourself in that
It
case.
is but here's the thing, right? I'm not immune to any of this. I think actually you gave me permission that day. If I remember correctly, you were like, "Well,
I believe I said you look. I say this from a place of hopeful kindness, but you look the worst I've ever seen you. I think I said you look terrible. You don't look like you're in any state to be recording a podcast.
yeah." And I was like, "Well, yep, that's fair. I probably am not." Right? But yeah, and I think it is giving ourselves permission, and sometimes we need to hear that externally from others as well. So
So maybe that speaks to the role of the partner or other people in the entrepreneur's life when they're in that kind of near exit or post exit phase.
yeah, because here's the thing, we experience all of these things and then our spouse is sort of along for the ride, right? And how much context do they have as to what you're experiencing? Or are they just sort of left to kind of fill in the blanks around how to support you in that?
Yeah, let's flip that around, Jamie. So, like, what advice would you have to kids or family members or spouses of entrepreneurs when they've kind of hit this point? And of course, this would apply to an entrepreneur supporting their spouse when they go through a big transition. Like, what guidance would you give to those who are maybe not at the center of the transition, but they're impacted in part of the broader community?
To me, there's a real opportunity to create a culture within the family system, and whether that is a couple system or kid involved system, to be able to talk through these things proactively and then also as the situation is unfolding, and to get real checkpoints. I think a real quick strategy that I think is sort of low hanging fruit in terms of our ability to grasp and execute pretty quickly is just a brief check-in. Tell me how we're doing on a scale of 1 to 10. Do you feel connected? Do you feel like it's kind of an alignment assessment, right? Where you can ask pretty quick questions. And if somebody says, "Oh, I feel like we're at an 8," and somebody else is like, 2, right? That gives you quick information on where you can start to sift through the disconnect from those two spaces. I think that's also something that you want to have in place before these stressful transitions come in so that it's already part of the regular cadence and culture in the family unit to be having these kinds of check-ins, but really making sure that we are taking the time to check in with our loved ones. How is this landing for you? What is it that you're experiencing? We also have roles that shift, right? All of a sudden, I was gone and I was involved in doing this thing all the time, and now I'm suddenly available all the time. Our spouses aren't always super excited about that. They might be, but not always, right? And the most important part of that is that you're aligned on what that looks like.
Yeah, so maybe just don't forget to check in and don't make assumptions about, whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, or probably more honestly, a mixture. I'm curious, Jimmy, you've got all this personal experience, but obviously you've worked in so many different contexts as well. Do you have any stories of couples who've done this transition, either maybe especially well or, have really struggled a lot?
So, yeah, I think one of the common themes that I see is a surprise. So, if we think about just exits, there tends to be this focus on the financial impact of that. And one of the surprising things for people is that the excitement around the financial impact tends to last for a maximum of about 48 hours. And it's shocking to people, right? Because it's this big thing. And what does this symbolize? It symbolizes it's not the money, right? It's the representation of it. It symbolizes freedom of time, right? And all of the time with my family, time to travel, time to explore some of these new ventures, time for the next project that I'm doing. So it's the representation of that. And so I think it surprises people when there's this huge endorphin rush and then there's almost a crash, right? So 24 to 48 hours, people can sort of come out of that thinking like, this is crazy. I don't feel good today. And that's a really surprising thing to say. That is one piece. I think for people who are really navigating this, in a they tend to have plans already in place for what that's going to look like and how they're going to spend their time to recalibrate. And sometimes that looks like, I was meeting with somebody recently and he's got a 3-year plan to be fully exited from this business. And for him, I said, what are you gonna do after? And he's got a solid plan. He said, I'm gonna rest. And I said, well, what does that actually look like? What does rest look like for you? And for him, it looks like taking what he's experienced and writing a book. And so he's got, 1 or 2, I forget if it was 1 or 2 years that's just really dedicated to processing, digesting, and expressing what all of this has done for him. And people have different iterations of that as well. The other thing that I think is common that I see is this role calibration concept that it does change roles internally within the household, and that those can be both big and small. And sometimes the way that we think things are going to happen are not always the way that they actually happen. And so having the framework to be able to talk through those in real time.
I love that. I mean, I think how often do we have this like big detailed plan, but then, yeah, for some reason it just ends at that exit point and not thinking about extending it further. If we go in the other direction, so if we're kind of, planning to the exit and post exit, I can imagine myself a decade ago rolling my eyes of saying, why would I waste my time thinking about this kind of success on the second mountain when I'm so busy climbing the first mountain? I just can't even seem to get my business to a place where it feels stable or solidly profitable, let alone something that's going to thrive to the point where someone might want to buy it. So what would your argument be to that skeptic sitting in the audience?
The way that we climb that first mountain really shapes how we enter and climb the second. And if we're really only focused on building for the sake of building and achievement and these external things, but we're not simultaneously building our relational and our emotional capacity, we hit that second mountain and it feels hollow. And so I think even very early on, we can plant seeds around this relational and emotional capacity that we're building for ourselves in tandem with, right? That make that second mountain a little bit less destabilizing when we get there.
Yep, I like that answer. Good answer. You're welcome back anytime, Jamie.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks, Cameron.
I'd love to know what's the role of mental health in this? Like entrepreneurs, we've talked about this a lot, but we're a very diverse bunch. And so, yeah, how do things like personality types or neurodiversity, how do these impact these transitions? And if we've got that kind of self-awareness or knowledge, how can we use that to better navigate these transitions?
I've actually been thinking about this concept recently of using emotions as KPIs and that we can actually translate those into more measurable and data driven information that we can use to our benefit. And I think that this is really aligned with that. We've talked a little bit about the different kind of mental health impacts that can come with this, right? Just to sort of recap that loss of identity, that post achievement letdown, navigating unstructured space, this relationship rebalancing, and then this kind of existential reflection space that comes along with this. And then I think considering again with the personality traits, and we know according to the data that many entrepreneurs do have neurodivergent brains. And there is a kind of standard personality type that entrepreneurs exhibit. And so we know, and they're all right, the dopaminergic related spaces. And so there's an opportunity.
Can you define dopaminergic for anyone who perhaps might have forgotten what that means?
So the interesting thing, so when we met with Dr. Michael Freeman, and then his new research, right? So his original research was really talking about looking at the data around entrepreneurial mental health and recognizing that entrepreneurs, by and large, experience mental health challenges at a higher rate than the normal population. And then his next set of research went in to explore why that exists. Right. And what he found is that it's really related to dopamine. So a lot of the personality traits. So dopamine is the neurotransmitter that's responsible for drive and ambition and that feel good chemical. And so you can see on the one hand, when that's not working in our favor, you can experience challenges with ADHD or anxiety or right bipolar, even hypomanic kind of spaces. And then on the other end, those dopamine traits are also highly correlated with successful entrepreneurial endeavors, right? Where you've got the drive and the, openness and the extroversion and those sorts of things. And so I think having an awareness of where in that spectrum you land at certain times and then pivoting, this is where I think it can be a great actually KPI, right? Where do you recognize where you're at on that spectrum? And then do you know how to pivot to optimize the dopamine traits that are positively correlated with how you're presenting in the world and then minimize the potential negative impact of that?
Well, and if like at the core dopamine, seeking means we're reward seeking as a personality type. When we take the company out, typically we lose a lot of those rewards, I would imagine, right? Like, as CEO founder, we tend to get a lot of validation and a lot of wins. We get a lot of losses too, but it's an exciting environment for lack of a better term. And, I certainly remember the first day in January of 2024 where I walked into my backyard office and sat down on the couch and was like, well, this is it. There's nothing on my calendar. It was a very different level of stimulation than I was used to. So if that self-awareness is key, you're talking about like emotions as a KPI, how do we build that? How do we get better at building that awareness of where we are on that spectrum, or even maybe what our emotional KPIs should be?
This is part of what I am working to break out because it's different for different people. And so some of it in the beginning is really around simply collecting data. So, do you have an awareness of what emotions you're experiencing, when you're experiencing them, to what degree are you experiencing them? And then what is the impact that that has both in the context of business and then also in the context of relationships? And over time, as you start to collect this data for yourself, trends will start to emerge. You will see some very clear indicators that you can then translate into those are then the things that we start to leverage. So how do I build my capacity around how I experience this specific emotion?
So, Jamie, I love that you mentioned that often the skills that we build in the first mountain and summiting that first mountain of how do we make this work are actually the ones that are going to help us to successfully summit that second mountain where we achieve external success. Can you talk a little bit about how someone could incorporate some of that skill building in that first mountain when they're just so busy and overwhelmed?
So when people are really busy and overwhelmed, it's so interesting. This concept keeps coming up of less is more, right? And so how do you start to build some practices in that aren't adding to what you're already doing, but can really be integrated into the things that you're currently doing? And so I think there's some relatively low hanging fruit for this. But the first step in all of this is still awareness. Are you aware that these are the things that you're also building for the summit and then this next mountain? And then what are the really small things that you can do to help remind yourself to drop into that space? Whether that's making sure that there's this focus on even something as simple as asking yourself the question, who am I without the business? And how does that question make you feel when you answer that? Can give you good insight into whether or not you're building the things that you need in that space or if there's something lacking. And then there's also another strategy that I really like when you're trying to integrate something into your life is to pair it with something that you're already doing. So for me, teeth brushing, because I know that I'm doing that every day for 2 minutes, 2 times a day at least, each day. And that can then become the cue to sort of drop in. So it doesn't have to be this like massive focus or thing that takes a tremendous amount of time, because it's not actually the amount of time that you're spending on it, it's the consistency of it. So, and whatever that looks like for those, 2 minutes twice a day that you're dropping into that space, that can be a really good reminder and kind of easy way to continue to build some of those things.
I love that. Yeah, piggybacking or habit stacking on something you've got when you're already so busy versus trying to add a new thing. I'm curious, we started this off with kind of achievement culture and the challenges when you achieve what you wanted. But, I can certainly see how there's challenges to that, but isn't that a lot better than a failed venture? Is there a version of this second mountain that happens when our dream definitively dies for something we've been pursuing?
Yeah, a lot of this has to do with how we process and articulate what failure is. I think externally, most entrepreneurs are going to say failure is a growth opportunity. What a beautiful opportunity to learn how to do, something different. And yet when there's actual failure behind the scenes, because success brings this level of external validation, the opposite of that is that failure elicits some level of shame or deficiency or area that we're not good enough in some capacity. And so I think knowing where you fall in that and the level to which you're failing and how you talk to yourself about that can give really good information on how to move forward from that.
It seems like it's kind of a rebuilding in either case, as you said, of like, what's your plan for recovery? How do your roles shift? And, what do you really want now?
Yeah, I mean, I think, right, in both cases, the deeper questions are actually the same. Who am I now? What matters most? How do I move forward without losing myself or my closest relationships? Right? So the external condition is the external condition, but the deeper questions are consistent.
Are the same. I love that. All right. Well, Jamie, let's do some rapid fire questions. I didn't give you these any access in advance. I tried to swap them up on a recent guest. They didn't like that. So we stuck to the script, but I don't even know what I'm going to ask. You ready?
Great. Let's go.
Okay. So my first question is, okay, you brush twice a day. How often do you floss?
I once a day. I also the tongue scraper, recently found that, and I love those things. Those are incredible.
Okay. Okay. Got it. What, often we try to go to these like really deep, like the 5% heaviest things in our lives in some of these circles. But I want to know, Jamie, what's something really boring about you?
What's boring about me?
Yeah, just something really unremarkable and boring about you.
My brain shuts down at 8 o'clock. And so if anybody anywhere asks questions of me post 8 p.m., uh, you get very, very little from me. 5 a.m. rolls around though, and I'm like, good morning. Ding, ding, ding.
What's your favorite possession?
I think that my favorite items currently are any of the items that I have from my grandmother. So I actually am looking, I have a whole bunch of red Depression era glass in my office, and a clock from the 1940s that does not work. It still says it's 10:26, so twice a day. The clock is correct.
What's it? Okay.
But I love the kind of historic antique stuff.
Love it.
Yeah.
And last question. What's the coldest place you've ever been? Lowest temperature you've ever experienced?
I think Wisconsin, actually. Wisconsin and going to Wisconsin after you've sort of acclimated to Arizona.
Yeah.
We went, there was a football game we attended, and it was 17 degrees out, and there were some people there in like flip-flops, right?
Yeah.
I showed up in ice fishing gear because I was terrified that I was gonna freeze.
I had a client in Wisconsin once when they had, what was it, the polar, you know what I'm talking about? It was like the polar bubble or Arctic
Yeah.
dome. I don't remember what it was.
Yeah.
And I was in Southern California, and it was literally 100 degrees hotter where I was than the like -30 it was in Wisconsin. All right. I'm going to land the plane. The FCC is going to take us off the air if I keep rambling. Jamie, let's do our final take. Is there anything you didn't get to or anything you really want to reiterate to our audience?
I think the only thing I would want to reiterate is just the importance of the balance and the sustainability of what we're creating, that it's not just the entity, there's also this individual health and wellness and relational space that's really, really critical and deserves our attention. So
All right. Thanks for joining, Jamie.
thanks for having me.